Welcome back to It Just Takes One. Today, I'd like to start by asking you a question. What do you know about dementia? Maybe somebody you know, somebody you care about, has been diagnosed with it and is living with it. Or maybe it's just a word that brings up a lot of uncertainty and fear. Whatever your knowledge or experience is with dementia and that diagnosis, I think you're going to learn a lot today on our episode. It's my pleasure to have our guest today, Dr. Ann Kenny. She is a geriatric and palliative care doctor and is the recent best-selling author of Your True North, a guided journal for those living with cognitive loss or dementia about legacy, love, and wishes for the end of a life well lived. Anne has been a geriatric and palliative care doctor for over 35 years. But as you'll learn on this episode, she actually had the real life experience of dementia when her mother was diagnosed with it. And you'll hear her talk about, in many ways, the gift that that gave to her. I don't want to give away too much. So I think I'll leave it there, and I will just invite you to sit back and listen in as Ann Kenny shares her story. This is It Just Takes One. One person, one experience, one moment to change your life. Anne, welcome to It Just Takes One. I have to say, I have been looking forward to our conversation. We've had many great conversations as we've worked on your book, but I have been looking forward to this one where we actually get to record it. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here. Yeah.
Your book has been out. So the book is called Your True North. We're going to dive into that in a little bit, but let's just start by giving the listeners a little bit more background on who you are, how we got connected in the first place, because we had a mutual connection there, and just paint a little bit more of a background of who you are and how you came to be the one that wrote this book.
Okay. I'm a geriatric and palliative care physician. So my background, I've been practicing medicine for over 35 years. But and I did research. I was in academia. I did research. I taught medical students, taught medical trainees. My passion has always been cognitive loss or dementia. And then my mother developed dementia, and I learned it at a whole new level because it's one thing to know it as a physician and to support families. But then when I became one of those families, I I went even deeper in understanding the disease and the impact of the disease on both the individual living with the disease and on those who support them. Um, so I wrote, I'm also an end of life specialist. And so my poor mother had to go through many end of life discussions with me while she could. And and that's what I would say to her. We're actually going to talk about the way you want to live, not the way you want to die, but so I can help you live that life till the end of your life. Um, and in my work, I meet so many people who are living with dementia. So at first, I wrote a book before the book we're going to talk about end of life care from my perspective as a daughter supporting someone. And so that book supports more the caregiver. But the book that we're talking about today is written more towards the person living with cognitive loss. And it's kind of what I did to my mom, but she wasn't as willing a partner as hopefully somebody who picked up the book will be. But it was to have her kind of go through her life and her values and her and to reflect and what are her dreams and aspirations, even in face of a diagnosis, because there's so much time to live well. And then how could I support her in making sure that happened? And then to really explore who she is so that when she got to a point where the disease of cognitive loss was causing more trouble, we knew how to help her and soothe her and um, keep the parts of her that weren't affected by the dementia more alive. And so when I finished the first book, um, and it was more to help caregivers, I started talking to more of my clients who are living with dementia, and we were having more conversations about them making choices, both for living today, living a little bit better at the next phase, and then how they would want to die. And um, I wrote the book with one of those individuals, Teresa Webb, who's living with a frontotemporal dementia. And she is a huge advocate for end of life choices and wanted to be able to have both her voice and my voice heard in like talking about kind of the tougher things that people may choose about physician assisted death and how some of those choices are taken away from people with cognitive loss and what they can do instead. I mean, for her, it was very important that piece came out, which is a little heavier, but my part was there's so many things you can do now to talk about how you want to live now, how you want to live as things change, to make sure that that stays a very positive experience. Because I've seen so many people live well, very well with dementia for a long, long time until they begin to die from dementia. And then I want them to be able to die well with dementia. So that's why I did this.
It's the thing that stands out to me as you're talking is that even though we're talking about something that people are afraid of, which might be dementia, which might be end of life, the one thing that you keep emphasizing is that it's not about the end, it's actually about making it so that you live your best life,
Right.
that it's about living, not about dying. And I
Exactly.
think that's a big point because fear is a huge emotion and it can shut us down. So I'm sure that people that are listening who have family members who have dementia, who may be suffering with it themselves, or just people in general that are so afraid of talking about the end of their life. What have you learned in your not just your professional, but also your personal experience about helping people to really understand that it's okay to talk about these things because it's about living?
Yeah, I think um, the hardest thing is we don't do anything well that we don't do, right? Like you don't if you don't bake, your first bread you make may taste flat or you may have over kneaded it or whatever. Um, but the more you talk about how you want to live and therefore how you want to die, the more you talk about your values, things we think of as so personal, but when you start sharing them, it becomes easier and easier, and you realize it's so nuanced and there's so many, and it becomes a growth and a creativity experience rather than this, "Ooh, I'm gonna have the one and done conversation. I'm gonna talk about death and it's gonna be over." I mean, my kids laugh. They're like, "Are we talking about death again?" I'm like, "Of course we are." Then, for me, it's just part of my day to day to day. And they're like, "Oh," they roll. I mean, kids roll their eyes at parents, I guess, all the time. But my mom kind of had that in the beginning too. She'd be like, "I don't want to talk about it," and I would say, "But I don't want to be alone with these choices later. So can you do it for me?" So sometimes it's if people realize that having these conversations and getting things out in the open are a gift, and that I think my mom finally made that shift that her biggest gift to me would be to help me support her. Um, and I would say that she she made that shift and started thinking of her dying as a way to continue to teach me as her child. And that's when she was able to make that switch to talking about it, being open about it, and helping me help her. She really taught me finally, I mean, this was a very strong, independent woman. She finally started to accept help. And that
Mm.
was like a huge gift to me because then I'm like, oh, this is how you're gracious in receiving. And
Mm.
I'm not sure I had learned that lesson, but she taught me that up to the time of her death, that how to receive graciously. She quit kind of fighting. She quit
Mm.
fighting death. She quit fighting talking about death. She quit fighting, um, to remain the independent that we all seem to value in the United States. And she opened to accepting help from others and doing it in a beautiful way, so that now I'm like, oh, life is give and take and give. And um that reciprocity with her remained to the end of her life. And it was a beautiful gift, and it was a beautiful thing to witness and be part of. I used, my friends would say, oh, it must be so hard for you to go and see your mother every day and give to her. And I was like, it's an honor, and she is giving back to me tenfold. It's not one way. That's the human connection is always two-way. It may not be two-way in verbs, verbal communication, but her nonverbal was amazing. And that's what I notice with everyone I care, and partnering in care with, is they're still communicating with me, maybe just not the way they did, but don't we all evolve? I hope I don't communicate like I did when I was 2 years old. I'm sure some days I do, but, I'm known for a good tantrum now and then, but, we're always all changing, and that includes people living with dementia. They're
Mm.
changing, but that doesn't mean they're not there, and if you look, they'll be there.
Mm. That is
Yeah.
such an important point. I want to stop there for a second because I think when people think of dementia or when you hear people talking about their family members that have dementia, they'll often use those words like they're not even there anymore. They don't even they're not the person. It's like they've already left. You hear
Yeah.
that often. And what you're saying is that's not actually what's happening.
Well, I think in a sense, it can be that way. Yes, if you're looking for the person that was a 40-year-old, they that person may be gone. And there is that grief that goes with, I don't have the same person in front of me. That is absolutely true. But but it's not an either or, it's an and. The person I am grieving the loss of that person I know, and I have the opportunity for a different relationship with the evolution of that person in front of me. You can make both of those true. Um,
Mm.
you can honor that grief because it's real, but there, but look for the positive in the changes. I think what happens, I see, is that people assume it will all be negative,
Mm.
but it's not all it doesn't have to all be negative. Um, you can see the negative, you can dwell on it if you'd like, but I don't know if you grow that much from that. You just stay in a place of sadness. I I think the people that really have, and I'm lucky because I have taken care of so many, or have partnered in care with so many people and their families, that I've seen people who kind of dwell on the negative. I've also seen those that did it so well. So I had the advantage of, and I try to put those stories in my books um where I get to see both sides. I get to see people who are only kind of dwelling in the negative, and I see those who look for some of the positives. It doesn't mean they're Pollyanna and that they only see the positive. It's bittersweet. It's the I mean that's I often say to people, before my mom got sick, I probably had an emotional range about 4 inches wide. And then after living with her and seeing, I got sadder for sure. There were some definite sadnesses, but I got much richer, deeper connections too. So my emotional range, grew out to 12 to 18 inches. It's just much bigger than it was. And I live a much more complete life now, crazy, because of partnering with somebody living with dementia. Um, so I so I know, and it was the experiences of some of the family members that I supported, and I saw them having this rich life. I was like, oh, that's possible. So yes, it's sad, and yes, it can be deep and rich. So it's not an either or. It's not sad or joyful. It's both.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
It's like two sides of a coin, right?
Yeah.
It's both. Which one
Right.
do you choose to flip over and focus on?
And some days, of course, I wallowed in, like, I had good emotions and bad emotions, and I had ugly emotions. No doubt about it. I felt them. I mean, I felt them all, but I finally learned to feel them and let them go and wait for the new one and see what the new one would be. And
Mm. Mm.
yeah,
It also brings back, we were talking just before we started recording about something that I want to make sure we bring in here too, because there is, along with that fear and along with those emotions and in all of it being real, there is also this element of, again, things that you hear people say that if I'm not going to go see my mom or this person because they don't even remember me anyway. They're not even going to know if I'm there or not.
yeah.
And just before we got on the call and started recording, you were talking about that. And I'd love you to share that with the listeners because I'd love for them to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. I mean, it should start at the like, once somebody is diagnosed with cognitive loss, often they themselves may kind of put themselves in a corner, or others may. I just had a friend of mine tell me that she's so sick of her sister infantilizing her that she wishes she would still connect with her kind of as sisters. Um, and her sister's not there yet. I said, we'll keep working with her. She'll get there. But as people become less verbal, and sometimes people say they're just not there, why even go visit them? They may not remember that you visited um, from an intellectual place, but they'll remember from an emotional place. I mean, my m- we would go if we went to see my mom. My kids would often come with me, and she was in a bad emotional place, like she was just having a bad day. Our job would just be to get her to giggle and laugh and like get her in a good mood. Like literally we did somersaults and we did cartwheels to do that, or pratfalls. She loved a good pratfall, and we would just get her laughing. And one of my kids was especially good at like falling for her, like literally falling. Um, and we would get her laughing. And there's research to show that that emotional part stays very much alive. That and and there's a carryover. So if we got her in a good mood before we left, that good mood would last until I would often check on her in the morning on my way to work, and she would still be in a good mood if we got her there. The other was like, one of the things I did with my mom is we would read like chicken soup stories,
Mhm.
the really sentimental syrupy ones.
Mhm.
And she would get teared up. And for all people would say, if she doesn't understand what you're reading her, but if it was emotional, she understood, and she would squeeze my arm, and I would look and she'd be tearing up. And so there's more going in than we often think. And it's not from up here. It may not be, we're not going to talk about, I don't know, Tolstoy's, framework for war and peace, but if we were talking about something heartfelt, it would get it, she would feel it. And that, so I that taught me to get out of my head and into my heart with her. And I do that with my clients as well, that you make a heart connection, and that is real, and they will notice that, and it will hold them for a while. You have to go back
Mm.
and keep doing it, just like anything good. But
Mm.
like ice cream. Ice cream's a
Like,
good one.
like brushing your teeth. Make sure you keep
Exactly.
doing it.
Yeah, you have to keep doing it. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. And I think that's a great message, to come from your heart. And maybe that's a good lesson for life, not
Right.
just for people
Yeah.
having the
When you're
experience
living
of
too much in
dementia.
your head, it's a good time to shift to your heart a little bit.
To your heart
Yeah.
sometimes. So this book, Your True North, it's a really, what I love about it is it's this sort of guided journal. You give some specific things that people can do. But then there is also Teresa's piece, which I thought was so beautiful. And you mentioned it, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about that because I think it could be eye-opening for people to realize that here is a woman who is living with dementia right now and, writing a book and
Yeah,
writing an excellent portion of this book, an important portion of this book.
right.
So, can you share a little bit more about Teresa and about some of the things that she has in here that really speak to where she is in her life and how capable she is,
Yeah.
even though she's living with this right now?
Yeah. So Teresa was a nurse when she started noticing that she was having difficulty with some words. And she went to see a physician, and she actually had an aneurysm as well. So she kind of had this complicated presentation, and they did surgery on the aneurysm, and there was still some problems. And she was like, something's not right. And they finally figured out that it was cognitive, the beginnings of frontotemporal dementia with specifically a phasic um, variant. It's what Bruce Willis has, and um, there's another Wendy Wendy Williams is
Mhm.
also that. So it's the same type of dementia that these other people have. And at first, like many people, Teresa went into a slump. And I would say that the majority of people I speak to go into kind of a depressive slump, as if you found out you had a terminal illness. Many of us would fall into that. And much like many of the survivors, I mean, I would like to call her a survivor, because she has lived about 15 or 20 years really well with this. And the way she lives well with her dementia is that she figured out how to decrease some of the stressors in her life. She started leaning into her strengths. She started exercising very religiously. She changed her diet to be amazing, and keeps herself stimulated, but mostly has purpose. She found a way to use her fear and turn it into a passion. So she said, there's not enough out there to help me. I'm going to be the helper for other people, and started an advocacy program for people living with frontotemporal dementia. She started becoming a national spokesperson, speaking in front of Congress. She's and she just she took her firecracker personality and turned it towards advocacy. And she won't give up on herself. She won't give up on the other people living with dementia. She wants the voices of people living with dementia to be heard and respected, and she wants a seat at the table. She's part of a grant program, and so she reads grants and of researchers who and she'll say, look, you're not acknowledging or respecting the people living with dementia. You need to change this grant to really she's a true advocate. And each
Mhm.
chapter of the book that I write has a memoir from someone like Teresa woven through it. So you hear the voices of Teresa and other people who have successfully lived with dementia and extended their time in the earliest phases, I think, because of that really strong purpose. And they all seem to have similarities. They all have found how movement, some kind of exercise or movement, and a dietary change, and that strong sense of purpose have, I think it's that trio of things have really helped them all live much longer in the early stages than most people who get isolated or get infantilized by their family. So they all learn to lean into their strengths, and like my mom, kind of accept help in the area of their weaknesses. And then that balance of, right now I have a disability. And if I had a disability in hearing, I would wear a hearing aid or I would accept accommodations. If I had visual hearing or visual problems, I would wear glasses and maybe have a white cane. They're saying, oh, I have cognitive disabilities. I'm going to shore up the disability part, but I'm going to lean into my strengths. And I'd say that Teresa does that, and everyone else that we highlight in the book does that. And I'm hoping that's part of the message that came forward is you can do that too. You can lean into your strengths and accept help where you need it. And that balance, you will live well. You will live much better than if you say, because there's such a stigma around cognitive loss, and that stigma includes our own personal stigma. I've heard from so many people, I'm embarrassed I have this. I respect that. You can be embarrassed for a while, but then you have to get over yourself and get out there, because otherwise you're going to end up being embarrassed until you isolate to the point that you lose your ability to be engaged.
Yeah.
And people say that, like um, I've had people who were beautiful pianists and something happened where they couldn't play, and then that pathway isn't reinforced, so then they can't play. So, and then they have to go back to kind of playing chopsticks for a bit to kind of open that brain pathway back up. But the goal is to keep things flowing where they flow and find workarounds where you can't. Just like, yeah. But to get past that stigma is so important. And Teresa did that beautifully.
Yes. And I think part of getting past that stigma is recognizing other people, seeing in other people the possibility. It's
Right.
hope, right? It's that
Right.
there is hope. You can see it, and then having some of those tools. But
Right.
I also think it's interesting because the title of your book is Your True North.
Right.
And that is an element of what you're describing here, because there is this strength that you have, this gift that you have, this purpose that you have. But not everybody recognizes they have that, right? So
Right.
talk about the actual phrase, your true north, and how it's used in this book as it relates to somebody living with dementia.
So I think when you're diagnosed with a terminal disease, but a chronic terminal disease, it is a, a time where you people often stop, pause, and say, what's going on? And it is a time, especially in the United States, where we just go, go, go. We don't necessarily stop and reflect very often. It is a time to reflect, and I think it's a time to say, what are my goals? What are my values? Who am I? And how do I want that to show up now? Because one of my clients used to say, I have a limited shelf life now. I know that. But don't we all? We all have a limited shelf life. That's what mortality is. When you get a new diagnosis of anything, it's a time to kind of stop and reflect on what is my true north, and can I start living from there? And I think once you know what your true north is, it makes it so much easier, because with cognitive loss, sometimes you have to make a lot of decisions early for how you want things to play out later, if you want to be part of the decisions. And so it's important to kind of ground yourself and figure out, what is my true north, so I can help plan what's coming for me, so I get to what I want down the road. Um, I don't mean to disparage the medical community. I'm part of it, but we kind of have a one size fits all. Everybody gets everything unless you tell us otherwise. And you, uh, and that's not necessarily what you would want if you had a progressive neurodegenerative disorder. You might not want everything. I don't think a lot of physicians think of dementia as terminal even. And so they continue to treat everything to the very end. So that's just a piece of it. But like, you could put that on anything. Housing. Where do you want to live? What's important? and what would you give up to keep your function? Or what would you like, again, what's your true north? And then what accommodations would you take on knowing that you have this disability coming your way? How would you adapt to your disability from your place of values? I think is very important. And it becomes a lot easier to state them to others, because statistics show that your kids aren't going to necessarily want to talk to you about your own disabilities and your own mortality. They're going to say, no, 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 or they want to keep you around. If that's not what you want, you have to have those conversations with them. And we talk about that a lot in the book. Like, you should do what you want and be able to communicate that with the people around you. And when you base that in values, they're much more likely to listen. Much like we don't want to talk about dying, we want to talk about living. People won't will open up conversations with you if it's values based, but not necessarily if it's, I don't know, if I said to you, Kelly, I don't want to spend all that money on this, you probably would say, no, 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 we'll spend any money we want, like, but if I said, one of my values is fiscal responsibility, and I want to leave a little bit of a legacy to you, even at the cost of maybe I wouldn't live an extra year, but that year isn't as important to me as leaving you a little something. You're much more likely to hear that if I come at it from my place of values than, no, Anne, we'll spend anything like, it's different.
Mhm.
It's the
Mhm.
same. I mean, it's the same, but it's different.
Mhm.
And you're more open to hearing about it if it's grounded in your values.
And let's say somebody doesn't really know what their values are. Maybe they haven't ever been intentional or even that self-aware of where their true north is.
Yeah.
What do you recommend? How do you help somebody figure out what those important pieces are for themselves?
So I mean, in the book, we actually do talk about, like, s- sit in some reflection. I like to use something called a Miller value sort. It's just like 50 words. And I like that one because it describes what the word is. So, because I can hyper intellectualize things sometimes and then start going, I wonder if they mean this or this by that word. And it basically is just a way to kind of sort through 50 cards, and just do it rapid fire to kind of and put them in piles, like, yes, this is very valuable to me, this is medium, this is low, until you kind of sort it down to about 10 words and then 5 words. And by paying attention, much like that bread analogy, if you don't bake, if you don't sit in it a little bit, it's going to be hard. But if you have a tool that, if I had a bread maker, it might be a little easier. So there's some tools in there, some exercises that will just help you think about it, to sit with it. And then, I mean, really a lot of the book is just saying, and now sit now for a little bit and think about it. Once we've got your juices flowing a bit, just sit and think about it. Try it out.
Mm.
Like, now try making a roll or a cinnamon bun or whatever, rather than just straight up bread.
And I think it's, having read the book, gone through it, I felt even as I was going through it that there were things for me, even though I'm not living with dementia, it's good for anybody to go through this process and to sit and think about these things, don't you think?
I do. I do. I mean, I think we don't, again, we're in a society that just runs so fast, and we can so easily get distracted with our phones or entertained. We don't sit. I mean, I'm getting old. I was raised when there were only 3 TV stations and PBS. And, the, my parents, if I said I was bored, they'd go, "Good. I'll fill your time for you." Boredom actually led to some reflection, right? But we don't have time to be bored anymore. And so we often don't reflect either. And we get caught up in other people's lives on social media or whatever. We don't necessarily figure out what makes me tick. I might know better what that makes the Kardashians tick than myself, right? I
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we
It's
don't
funny that
sit
you
and
mentioned that. We were just talking the other day. My stepdaughter was here, and we were talking about the three stations on the TV and how the TV used to end at 10 o'clock at night, and there would be a man's voice that said, "It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?" And then it would go to those lines, right? And
Yeah,
she was dumbfounded by it. She
right,
couldn't believe that there was such a thing,
right,
because certainly the next generation never knew anything but 24/7 TV
right,
and
right.
24/7
And
channels. And
there's so many positives to that, I get that, but one of them is not reflection or self-reflection, um, and I think we do have seasons in our lives, and getting a diagnosis marks a new season, but even for me, my mother getting a diagnosis marked a season for me. It made me start thinking, I'm about to become the old guard. I'm gonna, I, I had to take on a new mantle, and it was time for me to stop and think a little bit like, oh, what? I mean, it's great. From my mother's diagnosis, I've completely shifted my life around, um, because I found my true north. Because I took the time while trying to make her take the time to tell me what hers was, I found my own, and I'm so happy that I did, but I don't think I mean, on the path I was on, my nose was on the grindstone. I wasn't looking up for anything. Um, so in a way, her dementia was a huge gift to me to change
mm,
my life into something completely different.
going back to what you were saying about that emotional capacity that was built, but just out of curiosity and just to share a little bit more about that, in what way did you change? It sounds like before the diagnosis and going through that with your mother, you were nose to the grindstone, what you just described, just on the wheel. And now, where are you? What's important to you now?
Oh, well, I think always family was important, but I made sure that family became much more important. I would say my siblings and we were scattered to the winds, and now um, we have really nice relationships, and we're building them more and more every day. Um, I did two things before. I worked and I took care of my kids, and um, I now have a very robust group of friends that mean the world to me, and I travel extensively. Before, I didn't travel at all, and I mean, travel is so important to me, um, and just, like, learning new cultures, and I love to learn, and so before, I was always learning at work, but I learned again, it was about 4 inches of learning, and now I get to learn so many things. Um, yeah, I I prioritize seeing my kids, I travel with my kids, I travel with my friends. Um, it opened I got out of academia because and now I have many, many jobs I do, and I love them all. Like, I love them all. They're all passion projects. Um, and it's a great way to spend my days, like every day I just feel so grateful. I wake up and get to do fun and exciting things. I get to work with people living with dementia. I get to work with other physicians who are trying to figure out how to help their aging parents. Um, I I write books. I collaborate on writing books. Like some people call me and say, "Oh, I'm writing a book with two women I met at a conference," and she was like, "Oh, I would love this to be a book, but I don't know how." I was like, "Writing a book is easy. Come on, we can write a book." And a year later, we have the book written. It's amazing. So I just feel so lucky. And again, that's because I have that playfulness from my mom, and now that work is just play. Versus before, I think I was just being too rigid in how I was looking at it all.
Mm.
Yeah.
So beautiful. And again, I love just imagining the listeners hearing that and hearing how life can be different and that there is a gift in everything, even when it might seem like the darkest days, there is a gift in it.
Yeah.
So as we think about the listeners out there going through this, let's say there is somebody that has had a recent diagnosis and they're struggling with it and they're looking for hope. What would you say is the first thing that they need to do?
Um, Probably the first thing is just to feel sad for a little while, but once and and that's okay to just feel the sadness. But once they're done, I don't know if the book would help them or reaching out to anybody who can teach them a little bit about the disease so that they can see it's like I guess it's actually the next book that I'll be writing is to like learn about the disease, to know the disease, to know then know yourself, to learn to like know yourself and then adapt, like figure out what you need to do to adapt to the disease, figure out what you need to adapt within yourself, probably a mindset shift or a just kind of a new to expand that, and then connections. The other piece is the connections. So you're not alone. I mean, everyone I talk to says if I could tell somebody they're not alone, I would find a support group of other people living with cognitive loss so that you and if you're there's there's many ways to find them, but I work with an organization out of New York City, but they're national. They have online support groups. The institution is called Caring Kind New York City, and they have a program called Journey Together, which would teach them about the disease. Kind of it would be facilitated in the beginning, and then at the end, they can join a support group of peers that do that most people find to be quite a lifeline because it's so nice to know you're not alone and that other people are like you, and that they're thriving and that they're having bad days. I was just speaking to one person from that group. We're doing a program that we call Dementia Act 2, where we're using the information from some of these support groups to teach physicians what people live, the voices that these three people living with dementia are going to go with me to do grand rounds at several medical institutions. And so I do a little bit of how dementia is changing, and then they speak like from their stories and to educate the medical professionals on here's what we would have here's what we need from you. And one of them said the other day, I if I hadn't found this group of people, of my people, um, I would have just been floundering. So for them to find a support within their own group is, I think, the most because there will they say that in that group we forget, but nobody ever yells and nobody ever gets upset about it. And,
Mm,
we laugh about it. But one of them said, my wife yells at me when I forget things, but here, nobody yells at me. Yeah. They just want
beautiful.
love and support and connection,
Yeah. And that
just like
connection is so
like we all
valuable.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, just in life, it's important. And I can't help but think that as they're listening to you, they would like to connect with you as well. So certainly, if you're listening and you want to buy the book, you can get it on Amazon. It's available. More books are coming, but tell a little bit more about how they can connect with you if they're interested in learning
Okay.
more.
And I do also have I have a consulting service out of I have a blog called Together in Dementia, and a website togetherindementia.com. And I'm happy to work with an individual or a family who wants to work with me. Um, and they can contact me through the website. Uh, it's pretty easy to find me.
Great. I'll make sure all of that gets in the show notes below. I could talk to you all day. We always have such interesting conversations, and I'm excited about the next book coming. So we'll be working on that soon. But for now and for today, I hope that you, as you're listening, listeners, have learned a little bit more about what it means to live with a diagnosis of dementia, to help yourself, to help somebody else that might be living, to make those connections, to sit still and think through what you would like in your life so that you can live the best life that you can. And it
Absolutely.
brings me to the title of this podcast, Anne. When I decided to name it, It Just Takes One. I had this, that sort of deep, profound recognition of how simple one thing is, but how profound and how effusive it can be, a huge thing at the same
Yeah.
time. So, just out of curiosity, I like to ask each of our authors, what does It Just Takes One mean to you?
So I think in this, it would be, it just takes like one person to reach out to another living with cognitive loss to make that connection. And for the person living with cognitive loss, it's the same. It just takes reaching out that one time, and I'm sure you won't be alone. It just takes a little curiosity, a little courage, I guess it would be courage, a little bit of courage to get out of the stigma part and see what is beyond whatever's limiting you in in that new diagnosis, or that fear of it's all going to be good on the other side.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. And thank you so much. It's a pleasure working with you. It's a pleasure getting to know you. And I know that you are already helping so many people, but look forward to being able to help even more.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You're a great host. Thank you so much.